Welcome to the Learning for Legacy show with me, your host, Afam Onyenakala. This is all about the concept of making generational wealth understandable, practical, and accessible. I'll be exploring a range of topics and sharing conversations, interviews, and more. Because what good is building wealth if we don't build the people? Welcome to another edition of the show. Now, earlier we looked at understanding your learning style and various thinking styles. And so today we're going to look at something slightly different. We're going to touch on memory and memory skills. So I'm going to briefly look at how the brain works, then look at memory and memory skills, and then finally nutrition for the brain. The purpose of this is all to assist in our learning as we go forward. So first of all, if we look at the brain in itself, the brain contains approximately 1 trillion brain cells. Now, here you've got effectively 100 billion neurons, and a neuron is simply just a nerve cell. And between these neurons, you can have up to approximately 20,000 possible connections. And with current research, that may even be very different now. So with these connections, if you can have that number of connections between all of those neurons, the potential is that you can have greater connections than there are known atoms in the universe. So that gives you an indication of how powerful this organ that we have really is. So how does it work, and how does memory work, and how does that influence creative thinking? So when we look at the brain, in essence, we've got really 4 brains in one. So we've got a lower brain, central brain, an upper brain, and a little brain. So the lower brain, also known as the brain stem, this is the area that controls our instincts. So things that we don't even really think about on a daily basis, like breathing and heartbeat. It's more of these are functions that take place without us necessarily consciously making it happen. Now, after that, we've got the central brain, which is the limbic system. Now, this portion of the brain is wrapped around the brainstem, and it has a lot to do with our emotions. Now we move on to the next bit, which is the upper brain. This is also known as the cortex. This is where we think, we reason, we talk, we see, and this is where we create from. And finally, the little brain, also known as the cerebellum. This is what controls coordination and balance. So it's very effective in activities that we carry out, such as sports. So if we look at the brain in itself, you've got 2 sides to it. You've got the left side and the right side, as I mentioned in a previous episode. Now, the left side of the brain tends to deal with logic, words, numbers, and sequence, whereas the right side of the brain deals with rhythm, imagination, music, and color. Now, both sides here are linked together by that part of the central brain, as I mentioned earlier, called the limbic system. And again, this part of the brain is the emotional center of the brain, and it's very closely linked to long-term memory storage. So what we find is that you will learn quickly when both sides of the brain and the emotional center are very keenly involved together. So for example, you'll find that when you listen to music, the left side of your brain is processing the words and the right side of the brain is processing the music. And advertisers over centuries have known this and have used this method to get you to remember a myriad of products, and often with very cheesy songs. So next time you hear an advert and you ask yourself the question, why are they using such a really bad, really poor song, really cheesy song? There's a science behind that. It's there to help you to remember their products. So with memory, we have two types of memory, very similar to what you are familiar with computer products. So with our own memory, we've got both a short-term memory and a long-term memory. So the short-term memory has a lot to do with the sounds, sight, and feeling. So that's when you put that all together, you effectively have an auditory memory, a visual memory, and a physical memory, in essence. So that physical memory is what's known as haptic or kinesthetic, as I mentioned in a previous episode. It's to do with touch, feeling, movement in that respect. So this short-term memory, what it does is it will hold the information that we process temporarily, so just long enough for us to be able to use it. And that information is stored using patterns and strong associations. So what will happen is that we remember the information when we trigger the right association. So the long-term memory is where the information is stored or registered using a memory device, or in essence, repetitive techniques. So repetition is what stimulates and gives us the ability to memorize things. So if we then look at the process of memory itself, you may very well hear this described as the 4 R's of memory. And that's simply down to review, registration, retention, and recall. So when we review something, it is simply an attempt for us to remember a piece of information. So, again, and we use that through our visual, auditory, or kinesthetic senses. So effectively, with review, you may read something. So you're taking information visually, and then you would repeat it out loud. So by repeating it, you're stimulating yourself in an auditory fashion. And also by doing that, you're picturing it in your head. And then you can then jot down the reminders, and the physical action of writing down that reminder is engaging all of our senses. So that process is simply an attempt to remember a piece of information. So, you may read something, repeat it out loud, picture it in your head, and then write it down to try and remember it. So you're attempting to put that piece of information into your long-term memory. And that's where registration comes into it. So registration is simply getting that information again into your long-term memory. And the memory device that you use to do that is simply the form of repetition. Repetition is a memory device. Effectively, repetition is a memory device. So when you repeat something, you are effectively trying to get it from your short-term memory into your long-term memory. And retention, the 3rd R, is where you keep the information in your long-term memory long enough for it to be permanent. Again, I'll repeat that. So retention is keeping that information in your long-term memory long enough for it to be permanent. Now, the 4th R is the recall. And this is where what we attempt to do is to access those facts from our long-term memory when we need them. So, when we look at a situation such as the registration again, you can use a rhyme and association memory technique to do this. So, for example, what sometimes people do is that they will use a form of rhyme and association to get a piece of information into their long-term memory. So, for example, the number 7 rhymes with heaven. So you've got that rhyme association already. So you can think of the number 7, instantly it rhymes with heaven. And then in order to remember something or get into your long-term memory, there has to be a form of word association. So let's say, for example, you're trying to remember the word staircase. You've got 7 in heaven and staircase. So a way to actually do that is to combine both images. So you may have the image of a staircase winding all the way into heaven. And the more visual and expressive and almost ridiculous you make that seem, the easier it is for that to be embedded into your long-term memory. So to the point whereby if you're trying to remember, what was the word I wanted to remember? If you just think of 7 in heaven, instantly the picture in your mind brings the association between a staircase going all the way up into heaven. So again, what that will do is that's repetition. Once you've got the registration of getting that information into your long-term memory, that takes place through the repetition. So this is why songs that you learned 10 years ago, you still remember that. You don't consciously have to remember the lyrics to a 5-minute song that you know from 10 years ago. It will just come because through this process of rhyme and association, you have used the memory device of repetition to force that information into your long-term memory. So again, that process of memory is review, registration, retention, and recall. And so to do with recall, what happens is that we tend to recall more at the beginning and at the end of a learning period. So, items in particular associated with rhyme, repetition, and uniqueness enables that to happen. So again, we recall more at the beginning and end of learning periods. What tends to happen is that we recall less from the middle of learning periods. This is why some people would suggest, and some trains of thought would suggest that the mind needs a break every 30 to 60 minutes of any learning experience. This is why it's harder to often recall after many hours of study, even if you understand the material. So a good analogy of that is to think of the soil. So if you've got, say, a pitcher of water and you're pouring it onto the soil, naturally that water is going to seep into the ground. But once you get to a period of saturation, no matter how much water you pour, it's just simply going to just run off the surface. So learning is a bit like that. The mind needs a break every so often. Otherwise, it just seems as if the information you're trying to put into it is just spilling away. So, or the recall rather is harder. So a good way to improve memory recall after, say, for example, a 1 hour period of learning is to do, say, a first review after 10 minutes, just for a short duration of time, and then do a second review about 24 hours later, again, just simply for a few minutes. And then after that, do a third review a week later, and then a fourth review a month later. Now this process, it will be different for whatever you're learning and for how long you want to learn it for, but this is just simply a guide. Now, the final thing that I want to touch on is a little bit about nutrition for learning. I won't do an extensive deep dive into this, but just a bit of an intro and just a few tips that hopefully you can find helpful. So when we look at the brain in itself is about 2% of our body weight. But in essence, it actually uses about 20% of the energy you develop. So the brain needs food. It really needs certain things to function. So the brain needs really glucose for energy, and you can find that in fresh fruits and vegetables. And the messages themselves, they flow through the brain both electrically and chemically. So the electrical function of message flow through the brain is through each brain cell. So, you've got electrical signals passing through each brain cell. And chemically, as they jump from cell to cell. So good food and exercise, oxygen, it helps the brain, to generate electricity. And the neurotransmitters, the chemical flows, they also need protein to help improve memory. So, you can find these in things like peanuts and fish. And to feed the brain, there's certain minerals that are very helpful there. For example, if you look at iron helps to improve attention span and reasoning and learning. Sodium in your diet helps to improve the movement of the electrical current around the brain. And potassium can help to reduce nausea and drowsiness. And you can find potassium in things like bananas and the like. So what has been found is that with conditions such as Alzheimer's, the brain is not producing enough neurotransmitters for memory. So there have been previous studies that would suggest things such as linoleic acid can help to improve mental performance and help brain cell repair. Now, in the past, people would use things like 1 teaspoon of corn oil a day to do that. Now, I've not looked into that recently, so I would suggest do a bit of research just to see if that's current and if that's useful for today. But obviously, what also helps for the brain function is just obviously exercise, if it's healthy to do so, and drinking plenty of water. That helps to clear out toxins. I would suggest avoid fizzy drinks and caffeine because they tend to influence dehydration and the like. So those are just a few things that can help to assist. And with that introduction, again, we've touched on briefly how the brain works, a little bit about memory and memory skills, and a bit about nutrition for the brain. So whatever you can find from this information that's useful, feel free to apply. But I'd also recommend to also do your due diligence, do your own research, see what you would find particularly helpful for yourself, and take things from there. Thanks for listening to Learning for Legacy. To join our community or find out about what else we get up to, you can follow us on Twitter at Legacy Learning or on our website at www.legacylearning.co.uk. To access additional content or exclusives from this particular episode, please find the information within the show notes.